Well, to start this off, I grew up in the 1970s in a small town in North Carolina. Well, it was almost too small to be called a town with only a school and a couple of small shops. I'm guessing you can imagine how boring it would be to be a teenager there, and it would have been so if it wasn't for the woods. The neighborhood that I lived in was backed up to a big forest that spread out for about 3 miles, and it's where I spent most of my teenage years with my two best friends, Levi and Connor. They both were in my class at this time. We were all 15. Levi lived across the street. He was smart and kinda quiet, unlike Connor, who lived down at the bad side of the neighborhood. Connor was a troublemaker, always getting sent to the dean's office at least once a week. He was loud, obnoxious, and a natural leader, always finding something for us to do. Be it legal or not, when he was around, we were never bored. It was the beginning of the summer holidays, and Levi had called for me. We went down to get Connor, and he was messing around with his younger brother Scooter in the front yard. We asked him if he wanted to go into the woods, and he said yes. Now, just in case this may be necessary, Connor had almost black shaggy hair, the most beautiful eyes. One was a light blue while the other was a brownish color. He always wore scuffy red Converse shoes and a denim jacket, and of course, I just had the biggest crush on him. While Levi had style brown hair, brown eyes, and freckles, and was considerably shorter than me. Then there was myself, a red-headed brown-eyed girl that had quite a lot of people scared of me due to me being hyper. I was always ready to go somewhere or do something, and I was always talking about something. Anyway, we made our way into the woods and started walking into a random direction. We did this for fun, just to see what happens. Usually, we would try to get lost to try to find our way back, which most of the time just led us to being late for dinner and getting sent to our beds early, or, worse for worse, getting grounded. But we did it anyway. We were making our way along a deer trail that I didn't think we had ever been on before, when Connor found a pile of crap, and of course dipped a stick into it, and then tried to chase us with it. Levi, of course, freaked out and scattered. Neither of us wants to be smeared with crap. I ran off, and luckily for me, Connor followed Levi instead in the opposite direction. After a while of them not coming back, I began to think they had left me, and I was furious. I was walking down the way I had seen them run, when suddenly something stuck out the bush and grabbed me. I let out a surprised yelp, and Connor shushed me, only for me to shout to him, scaring me. Only when I saw the look on his face I decided that I shouldn't be talking, and I shut my mouth. Connor whispered to me, "You have got to say this," and began to lead me through the bushes, and further we went. The more we went, the more I could smell something disgusting. We came across something green. Levi started staring at the ground with a weird expression on his face. I was about to ask what was wrong, but Connor tugged me past him a few more feet, a wave to where there was this ditch, and in the ditch I could only describe as something out of a nightmare. It was a body. It was a purple-blue color. It almost looked swollen. The stench was so terrible I had to cover my mouth with my jumper so as not to gag. I backed up to where Levi was. Connor stood looking into the trench for about 5 more seconds before he walked back over to us. "Cool, huh?" he said with a grin. Levi gave him a disgusted look before saying, "No, it ain't cool. We need to go home and call the police." "What? Why?" What do you mean, why? There's a body dumped in the woods, Connor. It's clearly been murdered." "No, man is so cool, we cannot get the police. If we do, they're gonna take this away and think we were the killers." "Why would they think it was us?" "Because that's what the police do, man." "Don't be stupid, Connor. You can't stop me." "Fuck's sake, man. If you get the police out here, this will just be on the news, and we'll get questioned by everybody. They'll probably set out a curfew. They'll ban us from going into the forest. There'll be police everywhere. And then, you know what? Summer will freaking suck." I had just been quietly watching the argument take place, not really caring about what happened. But that got me. and there was no way in hell I was going to let my summer get ruined. Connor's right. What? You're not serious. Levi, we have the whole summer left to do whatever we want. Do you really want to spend it inside with a curfew? Yeah, I meant 2 against 1. Come on, you can't do anything stupid. Levi looked crushed. Fine, but I'm not coming near this again. Connor had let out a whoop of joy. We had made our way home listening to him talk about how cool it would be and how this would be our secret. Well, the secret didn't last very long, as by the end of the week Connor had shown all the rest of our friends, and it was a miracle that nobody did call the police. But I guess that just goes to show how close everybody was. We were like one big family, and almost like all families, we had our secrets. The body remained there for the rest of the summer. I only went up a few more times, and I'd gotten less interesting. As each time we went, there were only bones left. Anyway, on the last week of summer vacation, we decided to have a big camp out with all of our friends. It was me, Levi, Connor, Josh, and Wash. He was a loud-mouthed boy with mousy hair and blue eyes. Alice was there as well. She was a quiet girl with straight brown hair. Courtney was there, who I could only describe as the only girl I actually saw as a friend, probably because she was the only one who put thought into things and didn't have a bratty attitude. And then there was Kenny, the kid whose garden we were camping in. He had sandy blonde hair, brown eyes, freckles. His dad owned the biggest garden, so of course we could camp there. And as an added bonus, Kenny's garden backed right up into the woods. And even though we had promised Kenny's mom that we wouldn't go into the woods after dark, we were definitely planning to. But unfortunately, our plans were foiled by good old Mother Nature, as she decided to make it rain. So all 7 of us piled into this big tent, which belonged to Courtney. We played cards for about 2 hours, making up new games with crazy rules. Joss even suggested that we play strip poker, only to have a shoe chucked at him and to be told that if he carried on acting like a pedo, we would send him home. He quieted down after that, and we carried on playing until Kenny began complaining that we were going to run out of oxygen. This went on for a good 10 minutes before he decided to unzip the tent to stick out his head so he could breathe. Hey guys, the rain stopped, said Kenny excitedly. Seriously, I said. Yeah, let's go do something. We then all argued for a good 20 minutes about where we were going to go and what we were going to do. And so far, breaking into school and hanging out there was winning until Connor said, "Why don't we go see the body?" That was it. Everyone put on their shoes and coats, and Kenny took down his dollar store flashlight that he had hung from the roof of Courtney's tent, and off we went. Connor and Kenny led the way, but Kenny's flashlight, to be honest, was pretty crap and didn't light anything very well. And I don't believe that we needed anyway, because even though I hadn't been to the body in weeks, it was burned into my mind how to get there. The whole way there we were talking about what it was look like now, and how creepy this all was, as then the conversation took a turn that it never had before. Began talking about who we thought the body was and why they were dead, and who had murdered them. And this scared me, because it made me see it for what it really was. A dead body of a murdered person hidden by someone in the woods. And we had never reported it. I brought this issue up to Connor, who simply stated, "It's too late now, it's probably only bones left, and even if we did tell the police, we would get in trouble for hoarding on for so long." To this, I remained silent. They kept walking alongside Courtney and Levi, listening to Joss telling Alice some bullshit story behind us. They soon went silent though. As we came to the ditch, Connor and Kenny stood silently at the edge, shining the flashlight into it, Kenny's mouth agape at horror. I asked what it was, and Connor shushed me and beckoned me and the rest of us over with his finger. As I came up to the edge, what I saw had freaked me out. In that ditch was something piled on top of the original body. It was wrapped in a yellow floral pattern bedsheet, and it was tied with some sort of string at the top to make it not slip off. Everyone stood silent for what felt like hours, but in reality, it was probably only a couple of seconds before Connor pulled his Stanley knife out of his pocket and descended into the ditch. Levi began to protest, but Connor turned and shushed him and whispered to Kenny to shine his light on him. to which Kenny obeyed Connor, then catch some of the string and ported the seat to reveal the face of a young girl. She stared up at us with a dead glaze over her eyes and a blank expression. I felt like I was going to be sick. Then apparently so did Levi, as he began to violently retch, and he turned away. I couldn't turn away no matter how hard I tried. I was mesmerized. Connor suddenly jumped back, with a look of sudden realization and horror crossed his pale face as he began to scramble up the side of the ditch. Josh helped him up, and a chorus of "what happened and what was it" began, only to have him frantically shush us. With a shaking voice he said, "It's dry as bone." A feeling of absolute dread settled in my stomach. If you don't get what the big deal was, it had rained only an hour earlier, and everything was wet. This body was dry, which means that it had been put here recently. Everyone was silent. Then there was a noise behind us across the ditch, and my heart was in my throat. As we turned around and Kenny quickly pointed his flashlight at where the noise was coming from, then, click. Suddenly from across the ditch came an extremely bright light, illuminating us and making the person holding the light impossible to see. "Run," yelled Connor, grabbing me by the arm, and everyone sprinted. And whoever it was with the light sprinted to where we were. They were running violently, randomly illuminating trees and brushes that scared the shit out of some deer. And then suddenly, it went off. I felt my heart stop and Connor was muttering, "Shit, shit, shit, where the heck is he?" under his breath as we ran for our lives. I tried listening to hear if his guy was still coming after us, but everything was so blurry I just couldn't keep track of who was doing what and where the noises were. Levi stumbled, and a couple of seconds later, face streaked with tears of fear, followed by Josh. We huddled together and everyone began blabbering out what the heck was going on, and who was that, and what do we do if he finds us? But then Courtney spoke up. "Where's Alice?" Everyone went silent and looked towards the woods in fear, until Levi spoke up. "Kenny, go get your dad?" Connor looked over to glare at Levi before turning to Kenny and barking, "No. Kenny, don't get your dad. Let's think about this, okay?" "But what do you mean, let's think about this? He will call the police, and don't you think the police are going to believe us?" "I don't think so." This arguing went on for probably 5 more minutes, until eventually, everybody shushed up. Kenny begins pounding on his back door, and this goes on for about 5 minutes before Mr. Stokes opens the new door with a red face. "What are you guys doing? What are you playing, boys, 2 in the goddamn morning?" He hollered. "Dad, Alice is in the woods." "What? She ran in when we were playing tag and she hasn't come back out. We think she got lost." Mr. Stokes stared off into the woods for a bit, squinting, trying to see beyond the tree line before muttering an "okay" and repeating into the house, to only 5 minutes return with a big flashlight. He stomped off into the woods, and we all waited for about 20 minutes before he returned and said, "Fun's home, kids. Go home, get your fathers, and tell them to bring flashlights." And that was it. We all went home, told our parents what was going on, and the men went out into the woods to look for Alice. While the woman stood around in Kenny's backyard, we were all told to stay at home, to which I didn't. I crossed the street and knocked on Levi's door. He answered it and I stepped inside, and apparently Connor had the same idea, as he was sitting on the sofa in Levi's room, eating some chips. "Do you think they'll find her?" I asked quietly. "Yeah, she's probably just panicked and got herself lost," said Connor. "And what if he got her? What if she's dead? What are we gonna do then?" said Levi, as he stood by the window looking into the dark street. Suddenly, the sound of police sirens cut through the air. "Oh no," mumbled Levi as the police cars drove down the road to Kenny's house. We watched as 2 police cars pulled up and the men came out carrying big flashlights. They walked around the back into the woods. After that, I and Kenny went home. I watched out my window as suddenly 5 more police cars appeared at my parents' house. It was around 6 in the morning at this point. I asked my mother what had happened, and she told me that they found a body in the woods and that it wasn't looking good. The next day, the police interviewed all of us. We all stuck to Connor's story. they didn't find Alice. And just like he said, it would be there as news coverage. A ban on us was going into the woods, and there was a curfew for 9 p.m. When we went back to school, there was an assembly of safety for strangers. They found Alice in the end, 12 days later, chopped up into little pieces and crammed into a garbage can on the side of the road about 10 miles from her house. I have my own kids now, and since I've lost contact with all of my childhood friends apart from Levi, who I now have a child to, and he recently told me that Kenny had been killed due to an overdose. We were invited to a funeral along with the rest of the kids I grew up with. I will not be attending that funeral. I once rented a room in a small house in Hartford, Connecticut. This house was actually quite nice, with hardwood floors and a stove that heated the entire house during winter. You walked up some flat, circular stone steps to access the front door, and the landlady had a pretty garden out front. The back of the house was a bit of a mess, and she had, as I soon discovered, a hoarding disorder. Although I could see her home was cluttered, I simply needed a place to stay. One entire room was blocked off because she had so much stuff in it. Still, the room I was renting was charming and the bed was comfortable. I shared it with her one child, who was still in school. The bathroom was large enough to share, and there was a washer and dryer and Wi-Fi. Another person briefly rented the room downstairs before she bounced and checked out. I started having odd experiences in this house. It had an aura of stress to it. For instance, one night, I was alone in the house, as the landlady had gone to spend the weekend with her fiancé. It was cold enough, as she put wood chips in the stove before leaving. I enjoyed watching the flickering in the darkness. The living room took on a calmer feeling, like the fire inside the stove began to stir. All of a sudden, I had the awful feeling that someone was standing next to me. Spooked, I went upstairs into my room and shut the door. The next weird experience came when I was doing laundry in her messy basement. By this time, I was growing tired of the incredible mess. She kept the living room tidy, but that was about it. I wandered around the dark room as the washer spun, then stopped in a kind of odd horror. Someone had sprayed painted the words "fuck" in blood on the back of the steps. Entirely chilled, I found my Bible and prayed over the words. I wondered if Satanists had lived in the house or the witches at one point. I started to feel like I was living in the presence of evil. The room I was staying in grew colder, night after night, literally. I began to feel like I was suffocating and struggled to sleep. One night, I rolled over, sleepy and chilled, and looked at the digital alarm clock. It was around 4:20 a.m. I looked towards the window at the far end of the room, where she kept a round, mirrored coffee table. There was a dark mask there, with no face, just staring at me. I could see curly hair, but no distinct features. It was hovering, almost as if it was lying on its side. I screamed and turned on the light. I asked my landlady the next day if she had heard me screaming, but she denied it. I knew she had once been married to a man who evidently had abused her. When I spoke to her boyfriend, I decided to take a risk. I inquired about my landlady's husband, who is now deceased. Her fiancé told me that the neighbors had described him as evil. I hesitated when I asked if he had curly hair. He replied in the affirmative. I am convinced that I saw some sort of imprint of this person, manifested out of spiritual sensitivity, which I had possessed for most of my life. Later on, I saw a photo of this husband and the landlady's child. He indeed had dark curly hair. This happened back when I was 12 or 13 years old. Now, a little backstory here. My dad and I volunteered at a bird banding station, If you don't know what bird banding is, it is where researchers put small metal bands on the legs of birds and then release them to track their migration patterns. We'd set out mist nets in the woods to catch the birds. We used nets instead of traditional traps so we wouldn't harm the birds. So anyway, the guy who owned the bird banding station in the entire property, let's call him R, would let me wander the woods while he was collecting birds out of the nets. R's property was massive, with woods, countryside, marshland, and you name it, all out here on the edge of a small town. Now back to the story. It was a cool summer morning. I was wandering in my usual part of the forest. It wasn't long before I noticed that it was unusually silent, which was odd. I usually hear at least one thrush or blue jay, but there was nothing. All of a sudden in the distance, I hear what sounds like a distressed baby deer or cat. Being the curious animal lover I was, I followed the noise. However, as I got closer to the sound, it seemed to grow a lot farther away. It wasn't long before I came to the edge of R's property. The wailing sounded like it was coming from nearby 1 minute, and then sounding very far away the next. Despite being confused and a little creeped out, I for some reason still followed it. However, a few minutes later, I came across a small deer blind. I looked inside to see if anyone was messing with me, but there was nobody there. When I got a better look at the blind, I noticed something a bit off. There were massive slashes on the sides. They looked as if a person had slashed them with a knife or an animal's claw marks. But there were no bears in this part of Michigan. Odd. So being a curious 13-year-old, I continued on my way to finding this distressed animal. I was walking along the edge of R's woods, trying not to go too far. I'm starting to get frustrated. Where the heck was this scream coming from? So being the naive little girl I was, I mimicked the noise that I was hearing to try to find my way back to the animal, to see if it would show itself. Not a minute passes by and I hear a noise that I will never forget. It sounded like a dog's growl, mixed with a buck's grunt. No deer sounded like this though. Something in my brain told me to get the heck out of there, and I did, leaping over twigs and branches until I'm in R's front yard. As I'm making my way towards his house, I hear the same sound, growling, coming from the woods, about 10 meters behind me at the very least. So instead, I run towards the research sack, since R wasn't at the house and the doors would most likely be locked. I knew that no one would believe me. So I just said that a deer growled at me. However, I've heard deer grunts and snorts all my life, and they do not even compare to the animal that I heard. It didn't sound like a coyote or a dog either. Although I never saw the thing, I believe that it was trying to get me off the property to do who knows what. I'm guessing that it might have been a Wendigo, since they can mimic noises of other animals and even voices. I also live near the Great Lakes, a hot spot for Wendigo sightings, maybe even a skinwalker, but they tend to be more in the western states. So, whenever you're in the woods and something doesn't seem right, don't just brush it off. Last year, I had a very strange experience in a national forest out in California. I was by myself on a road trip with my dog, and I was driving pretty far into the Mendocino National Forest. I like to camp in national parks and forests because it's isolated, so my dog can roam and they're free of charge. A trade-off for sketchy rough drives into parks sometimes and a lack of service and assistance. Anyway, I was driving up this dirt road kind of curling up a mountain around maybe 5 p.m. It was very nice out, sunny and warm with a slight breeze. Nothing serious happened, but I felt extremely uncomfortable driving into the area. That feeling did not let up. Driving up the mountain, I felt like I shouldn't stay there, and I texted my boyfriend that it just didn't feel right in this area. But my phone completely lost service very quickly. I was looking for a sign of another person having been around the area lately, but didn't see anything. I pulled over and got out of my car with my dog to look over the edge and noticed a dead squirrel on some broken glass mixed in with dirt on the gravel road. Yucca, my dog, starts to growl slightly. She is vocal, but I've almost never seen her growl at anything other than dogs. I did see her growl at a possum once, so it could be something she smelled maybe. This place continued to make me feel quite on edge, but I pride myself on being an independent traveler and backpacker, so I decided to continue at least a little bit further with my grumbling pup to see if I could find a good place to camp. I continued to notice more dead animals. Keep in mind, no one is going to be going more than 5 to 10 miles per hour up this road anyway, and that's if anyone's even there. I hear men's voices. They sound close, and I think I should call out to them. So I stop my car and then kind of freeze and feel like I shouldn't. I can't really make out what they're saying. I don't see any sign of people anywhere, and I get back in my car and continue to slowly drive forward and cautiously look for what the voices could be coming from. I've never run into people in a national park or forest when I've gone this deep in. The unsettling feeling grows about the voices, which have sort of come and gone a few times, and scared and focused on getting out of there. I just distinctly remember being surprised at hearing grumbling when we started outside of my car. Kind of dangerously quickly, I went back down the mountain, not seeing any sign of anyone. I decided to spring for luxury and get a hotel for the night. I figured I was just fine, and a huge open spaces can be intimidating, I told myself. The voices could have been echoing from somewhere far off, and they just sounded close. Animals die, glass is broken, nothing happened, cool. But I remember this place. It sticks with me. Whenever I'm watching scary movies, if I'm walking my dog in the woods at night, nothing compares to that feeling I had driving up that mountain, and it's honestly kind of interesting to me, as well as frightening. I recently happened across some information as well, some Native American lore, that made me feel extremely uneasy. Fast forward a year. I've mentioned this place to a few people, and the haunting vibes that it gave, and nothing much more. I googled the national park once and didn't see anything, but didn't look much either. I like scary movies and things of that nature, hence my fascination with this little event. So my boyfriend and I were coming up fishing from our trip just yesterday. We were in Wyoming for a wedding. There were only 2 to 3 hours left and the sun had set, so we decided to listen to some scary podcasts and YouTube videos. We went from the No Sleep podcast to the X-Files, and ended up on some true stories video dealing with the Native American lore. I'm half paying attention, petting my dog and playing some Pokemon on an emulator, and I hear the narrator mention Wendigos. Very briefly, he says that they are casually known to mimic voices. I mean, when I say that I got horrible chills, I got horrible chills. I stare at my boyfriend and ask him if he remembers that national forest I was freaked out about last year. He says he does, and he reminds me that he texted me when I was probably close to a Wendigo. I remember him saying that, but didn't know much about their lore and thought he was just being funny, like, yeah, Bigfoot is probably stalking you, or some other dad joke. And he was like, no. I mean, I was mostly joking, but I said specifically because you said you were hearing voices that you couldn't find a trace of. I feel strange as hell and I start Googling Wendigos, etc. They are allegedly able to mimic human voices, and they will live in that sort of area. It all matched up. Obviously, there's a ton of questionable info out there, and I tried to find more reputable websites and authentic experiences. I've done a lot of solo traveling both in and out of the country, and I've never had such a bad feeling before. On top of seeing an unnecessary amount of dead animals in a national forest, which just seems strange, I don't think I'll be doing any more solo travels around there, unless it's around civilization, of course. Does anyone know of any authentic Native American lore? Or has anyone else had any kind of inexplicable experience like this? This happened to me when I was about 10 years old, and it still haunts me. This was around 1969 or 1970, and pop bottles was how us kids came up with money for candy or whatever. I would search everywhere for them, construction sites were gold mines. I would regularly search abandoned properties. I was a little braver than my friends, so I would always have a little more money to show for my efforts. There was a large and creepy house by itself on the outside of our neighborhood in our small little town that was clearly abandoned. I never went in there. Something about it just felt different and a little scary, even to me. But having nothing to show for my pop bottle search, I decided to quickly check it out. I should have stuck with my instincts, but I ignored them and went in, which was a big mistake. The walls were painted an awful shade of green, even the ceilings, but the chilling thing was the mirrors. There must have been hundreds of them. They were literally everywhere. Many were in the floor broken, and you couldn't even walk through without stepping on pieces of them. They were of all sizes and shapes, hanging on wires or frames, or just stands or shelves, or just leaning against the walls. You could see all around you, and every room you went. I never imagined something like this, and it blew my mind. I couldn't process what I was seeing because it horrified me. My heart started pounding and I felt dizzy. It was way too much, and I got out of there, and I didn't think my feet even touched the steps leaving the place. I sat by a tree for a long time and got myself together before going home. I was soaking wet from sweating and feeling very sick. I would never know who put those mirrors up or what they were afraid of, but that image has stayed with me my entire life. I even hate the shade of green when I see it. They had a house of mirrors at a fair, and just looking at it made me sick. Even at a department store that has a large display of backed by mirrors, I have to look away. My days of exploring abandoned places have come to an end. You never know what's going to be on inside. It might just give you a phobia you're stuck with for the rest of your life. Before I start the story, I should probably give you a little description of the place and myself. The area where this took place was out in a small farming village. There are basically sections of woods and farmland. On this occasion, the section of woods I was in had 3 defined barriers. To the north was an old railroad track. On the south and west was an open farmer's field. The east basically led to a denser block of trees. You'd eventually come to a road about a mile away if you didn't get lost. As for myself, while I wasn't a hunter, I always had a good sense of direction. Even when I couldn't see the sun or had any other guidelines, I was extremely comfortable with being alone in the woods and not afraid of going to hike in the dark. I found it peaceful, actually. I still do, but I'm more observant now, if that makes any sense. I also don't scare easily, and I don't go into a panic too often. Finally, I am also somewhat observant to the spiritual world, having seen and felt entities before this. So, to begin my story, the day started like any other day on a winter afternoon. I thought that I would go out to explore some patches of woods that I mentioned before. I always found it intimidating, but being a young kid and having explored everything in the area, this was to be one of the new places I would map out. So, I set out with bare minimum gear, really just an extra set of gloves and my favorite hiking stick. I knew there were still a few hours of daylight left, and I figured this wouldn't take too long, so I didn't think I would need too much more than that. When I first entered the patch of woods, everything was still and noisy. I could hear squirrels, birds, and the wind in the trees. Seeing as it was my first time, I stuck close to the border, walking along the length of the field. Eventually, I came to the southern border and noticed a few interesting rock piles, and I went to investigate. That's where I made my first mistake. Was not going back the way I came. I was in my explorer mode at this point and wanted to see everything, so I decided to go back through the heart of this wood. As I got farther into the heart of the woods, I noticed that several things were starting to become off. All the noise seemingly died down. At the time, I rationalized that as I was the predator, so all the animals quieted down for me. Now, I'm not so sure. The other odd thing was that I had to sense that I was being watched. It felt like from a distance, though. The final thing was that I noticed when I tried to backtrack, going back was harder than going forward, almost as if I was being led somewhere. I checked my internal compass, as I don't get lost and haven't except for that time, which indicated the direction I was going was north, and strongly north of that. As I was walking along, I could still feel the gaze of this thing, but it seemed closer now. Looking behind me revealed only trees. I continued on, despite the fact that the area I was in didn't look like the area close to the railroad tracks. What I didn't know was that I was heading towards the deep patch of woods, where it would be difficult to find someone. Suddenly, I felt the thing move closer still. There was no noise, and I tried to say it was all in my head, or a hunter was messing with me. But what didn't help was the fact that whatever this thing was, it was either so silent I couldn't hear it, or it wasn't something physical. I could feel this thing increase its pace. At this point, the trees up ahead thinned out and I came into a field. It took me a few minutes to realize where I was and quickly made an adjustment to my course. I felt the thing again increase to my speed, narrowing down the gap between it and myself. I lunged deep into the railroad tracks, the northern border, and all the sounds came back. I could hear wildlife again, kids screaming at a nearby pond, and farther off I could hear vehicles. However, I still felt the eyes glaring daggers at me, just out of sight in the denser woods. It felt evil. The nasty energy radiated off whatever it was, but it would not show itself, nor did it step foot onto the railroad tracks. All on my way home, I still felt it following on its side of the woods, till I came to civilization, and it seemed to turn and leave. As to say what it was, I cannot say. I have experienced a similar feeling 2 places since then. Once at a cemetery, and the last at an asylum in Ohio. I hesitate to say it was a physical creature, as I never saw or really heard anything, but I did feel it. Looking back now, I'm wondering if it was possibly something that thought I was up to no good on its turf, and maybe it was purposely trying to scare me off. But why chase me deeper into the woods? I haven't been back to that area since, and I don't plan on going back anytime soon. It was summer of 2018, and like many others, I went on vacation to a place somewhat isolated from people, just to get away. I had gone with my 2 cousins to a ranch we own in Lake Perris, California. For reference, I will call one M and the older one J. M being the same age as me at 24, and J at 28. I had been planning to go visit them for almost 3 years, but I hadn't gotten the chance, due to transportation and always having to work. I only had just gotten the chance to be able to travel because I had crashed my brand new Ninja motorcycle in September of 2017, breaking my collarbone and 3 of my ribs, rendering me unable to work. While recovering, I was living in the Bay Area by San Francisco, and to think I wanted to ride 8 to 10 hours out to my family's ranch on a bike, that would have been suicide, since I'm not at all familiar with the roads. Anyways, I had finally gone to visit, and I thought it was going to take much of my stress away. In many ways, it did. But during my time there, it seemed like things just started to get worse. Not only did my girl dump me, but strange things started happening again, like my uncle's mom passing away, and, along with my cousin M that was sitting next to me at the time, seeing her spirit late one night at around 2 a.m. We both started to see weird things. We both turned to each other one night to see something peeking into the room at the same time, and I asked him, Did you see that? I stood up to see if it was my other cousin trying to creep us out, When I walked out the door, I saw my great aunt's face and top torso turning and fading away into the thin air. I automatically ran into the room on my tippy toes and both hands on my chest, repeating what I saw to her, over and over again. Well, 2 days after, in between everything that was happening at the time, me and my cousin Jay decided to go smoke a bowl under the large evergreen tree in the back, by where all the cow, chickens, and goats are kept, with the intention of avoiding my aunts and uncles smelling what we were up to, out of respect. So, it was a bright sunny day. I and Jay, along with our huge all-black 200-pound Great Dane Abigail, was just chilling on a wooden bench under the evergreen, staring out to some of the hills, where there were no more 2 or 3 miles away. I nursed a large black horse, pacing side to side in the middle of the 2 biggest hills, behind what looked like a barbed wire fence that ran along the top of the hills, pairing the sides of the old abandoned building that looked like it was used to be a slaughterhouse. Really, thinking nothing of it, I looked at the dog laying in front of us, whose head and ears were both aiming straight up at the black figure, high up between the hills. When I realized just how long that thing had been there, I had seen it come up from the hills about 15 or 20 minutes earlier, and Abigail had not taken her eyes off of it the entire time. So I turned to my cousin to tell him about the horse, and if he had ever seen it there before, just to find him frozen with the bong and lighter in his hands, also looking right at it. He had this look of terror on his face. When I looked back towards the thing, I saw it was standing on his 2 back legs and facing right at us. Its front legs were side by side, as it was trying to intimidate us or something. We were all just frozen, including the dog. She didn't make a move. I think either she was used to it, or she felt safe with having us around. After almost a minute of looking at it, it seemed to shrink before our eyes, till it almost looked human-like. When I said to Jay, "Holy crap, I think that might be a skinwalker," he quickly responded by telling me to shut up and to ignore it. He almost begged me to be quiet. It went from what looked like a 10-foot tall creature thing to like 6 foot in only a few seconds. Judging by the old building only about 100 yards away from it, I know these things and what they're capable of. I'm Mexican born in California, but Mexican culture has a big part of my life. Along with its folklore and older stories of witchcraft and people who practice its deeper roots, Mexican culture is right up there next to Native American culture, if not the same. I'm scared to even mention any of this to anyone, but it's good for a cause. It's time that people know the truths and secrets of humans and unhuman things that are so oblivious to humanity, to that thing dwelling in the hills of Lake Paris. Stay the hell away from our family, and hopefully I'll never have to see this thing again. Also, importance to the evergreen tree that we were at. The evergreen tree is known to be used by witch doctors of Mexico to keep evil and bad spirits away. Maybe not just a coincidence that there is a big-ass one in the middle of our ranch. I don't know why, but that dog would not leave my side for 2.5 weeks when I was there. Even my cousins pointed it out. Jay also told me that I'm weird, but in a good way, whatever that means. About 3 years ago, I struggled severely with depression and suicidal thoughts. Those thoughts later manifested into plots. I stay up at night thinking about how I want to go out of this world. I thought about pills, slitting my wrist, all the cliche stuff you see in the movies. Although, I eventually decided upon a slow bleed method. I constructed a plan to make a 2-hour drive from my house to the Inyo National Forest after work on a Friday and get lost. The plan was simple and stupid. I tried to survive as long as possible until something killed me, be it dehydration, more fatigue, or whatever else nature had to throw my way. I ordered some survival essentials on Amazon, packed a bag, and left as planned. I don't know what made this slow bleed idea so seductive, but my mind was set to it. I had no idea where I was going, but that drive felt like I was 10 again, and on my way to Disneyland with my parents for the first time. I felt so overjoyed and relieved. I got there, parked my car behind some bushes and started walking. It was about 5 o'clock and the sun was falling quickly. Bad planning on my part, so I started running, deeper and deeper into the forest. I would run, then tire, so I'd walk a while, then run again, and I repeated this process for about 3 hours. I stopped at a clearing in the trees. It was around a little patch of mostly dead grass and leaves. I pitched my tent, unrolled my sleeping bag, and fell asleep, happy as can be. The next morning was far less tranquil. However, I woke up feeling like I had a terrible hangover, and I had no idea where I was or how I'd gotten there for at least 5 minutes. I began breathing rapidly and started jogging in random directions, trying to retrace my steps. I ended up getting even more lost and separating myself from my gear and tent. I tried telling myself that this is what I wanted, but for some reason, I knew it wasn't anymore. I remember repeating no choice over and over again. That was a really cold night. I tried doing push-ups to keep me warm, but that hardly lasted. I tried singing Vienna by Billy Joel, where I was too cold and my teeth kept chattering. Although the cold was nothing compared to the fear. Every falling leaf or trickling sound of the stream was a vicious predator in my mind. There was a point where I couldn't tell whether I was shaking from fear or the cold or a mixture of both. Finally, the morning came and I slept through most of the day on the ground, my back to a fallen tree stump. I woke at around 3 p.m. and once again I panicked. I began jogging in a seemingly random direction once again, till I hit the road I came on. That feeling of relief was something I would never be able to explain. It humbled me, yet lifted me up. I walked up the road until a very nice old man in a big black truck pulled over to see if I needed help. I told him I was hiking and got lost. He drove me up the road to my car and I drove home. That weekend changed everything for me. I have never had a suicidal thought again, and I got the help I needed to deal with my depression. This isn't very much of a survival story, but the whole experience changed my point of view on life and self-worth. I'm still working on constructing a suitable life for myself, but whenever I'm discouraged or I want to quit, I think back to that night in the forest, and after a quick shudder I realize just how much life means to me. It was a stupid plan, but I'm glad it was. I may not have survived a slightly more elaborate one,